in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Dare to Speak by Suzanne Nossel. In her book, Suzanne wades into the very important but highly fraught discussion raging in our country today about free speech. She points out, as she points out, the issue of free speech now all too often is said to be inconsistent with the promotion of such values as diversity, equality, and inclusion. There are calls to censor speech to protect minorities, and arguments can be heard contending that to achieve a more equal society might require narrowing the bounds of public expression. Suzanne remains convinced that bigotry and intolerance can be fought without giving way on the principle of free speech, although she's clear-minded about and sensitive to the harms that have been and continue to be done in the name of unfettered expression. That's why she also says free speech needs to take account of systemic inequalities in our society. Her book is constructed around 20 principles offered as guidelines for ensuring that democratic debate is, on the one hand, open and freewheeling, but also respectful of the diversity and inequalities in our society. Suzanne writes with both passion and authority in making a pretty compelling case. She also writes from a position of considerable experience. She's currently the CEO of PEN America, an organization of writers and their allies committed to protecting and advancing free expression, human rights, and literature. Educated as a lawyer, Suzanne also has served as CEO of Human Rights Watch and as executive director of Amnesty International USA, and she's held senior State Department positions in the Clinton and Obama administration. In conversation with Suzanne this evening will be Wajahat Ali, who's been a journalist, TV host, lawyer, and playwright, and currently contributes op-ed pieces to the New York Times on religion, family life, and politics in America. Also, as I just learned a moment ago, he signed a contract yesterday for a book to be called Go Back to Where You Came From and Other Helpful Recommendations on How to Become American. It's due out next year. So Suzanne and Wajahat, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Your check is in the mail for that nice shout out for my book, which I still have to write. But today is actually Happy Publication Day for Suzanne Nossel. Her book just came out. It's called Dare to Speak. And for those of you who have joined us today, please purchase this book from Politics and Prose. Support your local bookstore. And it's such an auspicious occasion that I actually wore a collared shirt for the first time during lockdown for Suzanne. And I actually washed my face. I cannot protect this sanctuary from my 3 wildlings who might burst through the door. But if it happens, they're very cute. And I hope you guys are very tolerant of that interruption. Suzanne, you got this wonderful introduction from Brad. And I want to kick this off with the impetus of this book is interesting because it combines actually all of my worlds. In 2009, you were with the State Department. You have served under both the Obama administration and the Clinton administration. But in 2009 specifically, you were dealing with Muslim countries, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, who at that time were deeply concerned about anti-Muslim bigotry and religious defamation. Now, Pakistan, my family's country of origin, was the chair of the OIC at that time. And they were thinking about cracking down on religious defamation. So as part of the State Department in 2009, you went to Pakistan. The food was delicious, I'm sure you will agree. And you said, let me give you an alternative. Let's use free speech in a strategically different way that might help you actually achieve your goal, but in a better way that actually protects freedom of speech. And as a result of this, I want to quote The Economist. They said that you pulled off a, quote, diplomatic coup. So story time, Suzanne, take it away. I'm going to let you flex a little bit. Tell us about this story and how that was the impetus for this book that you decided to write in 2020 at this moment in U.S. history.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you, Wajahat, and particularly building on our work together at PEN America, elevating Muslim American voices through a whole series of conversations over the last few years that you've been such an essential part of. So I'm really honored to finally get my own chance to be in conversation with you, and you look fantastic. So yeah, it was a strange situation that I walked into. Basically, it was in the years post 9/11 and post the Danish cartoon controversy, which I don't know if people remember, but this Danish newspaper had published a series of cartoon images of the Muslim prophet Muhammad with things like, a turban on his head that had, a wick at the top. It looked like a bomb, and other images that were considered demeaning and derogatory. And in Muslim culture and religion, you're not supposed to depict the prophet, at all, or show his face. And so this was seen as sacrilegious. There wasn't an uprising right away when they were first published, but a few months later, I think some religious leaders began to focus on the cartoons, and a sense of outrage built up, and there were some riots around the world. People lost their lives. And that prompted this move by the Organization of the Islamic Conference within the United Nations to say, hey, we got to do something about the problem of what they called the defamation of religion. So insults to religion. And they introduced a series of resolutions. One would be brought to the table every year in New York, one in Geneva, where the Human Rights Council meets. And they were also seeking a binding treaty that would have banned the defamation of religion, just sort of saying this is a hurtful, harmful thing. It feeds into stereotypes. It's insulting to us. It reviles our culture. And we want the international community to do something about it. And this is a time where intolerance toward Muslims, sort of in the wake of 9/11, is on the rise. And we feel persecuted and victimized in many countries around the world. And so when I came in, though, our instructions were that we had to oppose these resolutions tooth and nail because they were infringements on freedom of expression. By banning speech, banning cartoons, they would violate both international free expression precepts and also our own First Amendment. So we would go to battle twice a year in New York and Geneva, rallying votes to try to get these resolutions voted down. And to me, the whole exercise seemed incredibly counterproductive. It struck me that the Islamic delegations, had a point about religious intolerance. And it was something we actually as Americans were concerned with too. We had our own envoys to the Muslim world and to eradicate religious intolerance. That was a priority for the Obama administration. So we shouldn't be turning a blind eye to that. And they also had a fealty to free expression, at least in name. They'd signed the treaties upholding free expression. And so my thought was, isn't there a better way? Can we come to something else that will actually advance one or both of these goals instead of a ritualized exercise that does nothing for either? And so we gradually put together a kind of alternative resolution that focused on practical measures to resolve religious intolerance, education, dialogue, bringing our experts from the Justice Department on the prosecution of hate crimes together with their counterparts from around the world to share the best techniques. And, I won't say it happened overnight, but they got behind that. They could recognize that tangible steps to address religious intolerance were going to be more meaningful than this highly contentious resolution. And so the diplomatic coup in the end was getting consensus on this alternative and their decision to no longer pursue the defamation of religion. And that's actually pretty much held during the ensuing, now sort of 11 or so years. And to me, that was sort of the impetus for exploring these issues of how, whether it's anti-racism, the quest for greater equality and justice in society, bump up against free speech protections, but there can be ways to fight through and find solutions that satisfy both sides.
Yeah, and 11 years later, now we have the Trump administration and the Muslim ban. So this is where we're at, just to show the difference of approaches. But that experience that you just shared with us kind of gave the impetus for this book, where it's not just an analysis, right, of these really messy, I think we should call it messy, these messy tensions between free speech, the First Amendment rights, but also for marginalized communities to be like, hey, yeah, you have a First Amendment right and free speech, but don't I have a right to like not be persecuted? And what's the balance between government overreach? How much of the government intrudes? Social media, what's the responsibility? Your book tackles this, and you also, in addition to descriptions, you actually give prescriptions also, you give advice. So one of the first advice that you actually gave in this book, and I actually read the book, Suzanne, for you, it reminded me of what Timothy Snyder, a professor and expert on authoritarianism, warned about a couple of years ago when he released his best-selling book on tyranny. He said, be mindful and be careful of language. And specifically, you said, be conscientious with language. That's your first chapter. And I recall my trip to Auschwitz about 2 years ago. It's my first time. The tour guide, told me it always begins with words. And his grandfather had escaped Auschwitz. And at that time, this was just a few months removed from the 2018 midterm elections. If you remember, invasion, immigrants, rapists, criminals, swarm, horde, right? Other words were used to dehumanize an entire group of people. So what do you say to those people who say in today's climate, stop being so sensitive, Suzanne, or politically correct? F your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. It's just words, not stones or guns. I'm being conscientious with my language. I'm telling it like it is, and I don't want to be politically correct. Your response?
Yeah, look, we're trying to live together in an increasingly diverse, digitized, and highly polarized society. And the argument in the book really is that to do that without compromising robust protections for free speech put some responsibilities on all of us. We do, in my mind, bear a responsibility to be conscientious with language. And that principle really grew out of a seminar on free speech that I attended a few years ago at Wellesley College. And it was right around the time that there were blow-ups, if you remember, at Yale over the Halloween costumes.
Right.
That contentious, series of dueling memos about whether Yale University ought to police student Halloween costumes, and at the same time at the University of Missouri over a series of racist incidents. And you had this group of free speech experts together in the room from around the world, and they were really pretty irate over this and sort of talking the way you were just talking, saying, these coddled students, they can't tolerate a message that they don't agree with, and everything makes them feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and they're censorious. And, I was sort of nodding along and thinking, I run a free speech organization, this is really no good. And then there were also some students, though, in the room. And one student, actually the student body president at the time of Wellesley College, sort of stood up and she said kind of very calmly, what's wrong with asking for linguistic conscientiousness? Asking people to be mindful of the words they choose and be cognizant of who's in their audience and how, their choice of phrase may land. And listening to her was a bit of an epiphany for me, because I think amongst free speech circles, there had been a kind of dismissiveness toward a rising generation that has different standards when it comes to speech. It is more exacting. It's a much more diverse generation. These are kids who've grown up with people from all kinds, obviously it depends where you're from in the country, but oftentimes all kinds of backgrounds, sexual orientation is very much out in the open. There are people who are non-binary and transgender, and they're used to grappling with all kinds of identities, and they have to figure out how to do so in a sensitive way so that they can get along with their classmates, their roommates. And what she was voicing to me actually was kind of a portal into the future, that, how are we going to get along and sustain robust protections for free speech? Well, one thing that's going to be required is linguistic conscientiousness. We've got to be more aware of how we speak, how it comes across, whether we're riling people up and inciting them, whether we're insulting them, whether what sounds benign to me and was always the way things were talked about in my home could to you be deeply offensive, because we come from different backgrounds. But if I'm talking with you, I bear an obligation to have some cognizance of what to say and what not to say, how to talk about immigrants or Muslims. And so, to me, this is something we have to take on board. And if you believe in free speech, I think conscientiousness is an obligation, because otherwise the calls and the demands that you reference to silence speech in the name of protecting people from hurt and harm and denigration are going to become all the more compelling.
We're going to talk about colleges a lot more, but speaking about colleges and speaking about linguistic conscientiousness and in the adapting, evolving generation, which is more diverse, let's take it back to college. Let's take it to Jordan Peterson, right? Who in Canada, not the United States of America, said, no, I will not address my students by their desired pronoun of they or them. He's talking about the trans students, right? And he actually made a big fuss of it and said, I have a First Amendment right. And it became a lightning rod conversation. And so to those who say, and especially comes down to pronouns now, right? That's the cultural schism. For those who say, I do not want to recognize this pronoun. It's too confusing to me. I don't want to switch up my pronoun game for these kids. That's my First Amendment right. How would you respond to many of those Americans who are using their First Amendment to say, sure, they have a right to call themselves they or, non-gender binary, but I have a right to just dismiss all of that as nonsense?
Sure. Like, look, when the evolution in pronouns sort of began to pick up steam, probably, I don't know if it was about 5 or 6 years ago, before which time it was pretty rare to encounter someone. I'm not sure I had encountered someone who went by pronouns other than he and she. When it first happened, I think for a lot of people, it felt uncomfortable. People sort of said, well, this is not grammatical. This is awkward. They would avoid using the pronouns, just call the person by their name, even if they're repeating their name 5 times in a single sentence. And I think what many people sort of gradually came to as pronoun use other than he and she became more common, the they and them, was that this is about individual human beings and their own dignity, autonomy, and identity. This is how they want to be known. So if you consider yourself sort of a decent person who's respectful of others, who doesn't want to insult others, why wouldn't you use the pronoun that they choose and designate for themselves? And look, do you have a First Amendment right to call somebody by the wrong name? I suppose you do. But if that forms part of a kind of harassment where, for example, in the classroom, someone is being denied really the opportunity to participate on their own terms. They have to fit into a gender identity, not their own, in order to be recognized in your classroom. I don't think this has been adjudicated yet in a court necessarily, but I think there'd be a strong argument that that would violate your right not to be victimized by gender discrimination. And so, if it, depending on the setting, look, if it happens in the supermarket, that's not going to be at play. But if it's a professor in a classroom, I really think it could be.
Yeah, and again, brings up this tension, right, between the freedom of speech to say whatever you want and also people's freedom of speech or expectation in a society, in a civilized society, to also be free from harm and discrimination. And you're talking about responsibility, individual responsibility, obligations. Let's take it a step further to institutional responsibility. And to quote Spider-Man, who quotes Uncle Ben, who quotes Voltaire, with great power comes great responsibility. And let's make things very juicy. Let's talk about the New York Times decision to run Tom Cotton's op-ed, which was kind of a full-throated defense and I would say a misreading of the Constitution to essentially authorize the use of military police against citizens. Now, for those of you who have not followed this controversy, the New York Times published this piece by Tom Cotton. There was, for the first time, really many, not just people of color, but many editors and writers in the New York Times who criticized the publication of this piece as protesters were exercising the First Amendment right to demonstrate the killing of George Floyd. There was tear gas, there was assault, there was violence. And then there was a review. And then James Bennett, then op-ed editor, said there was a mistake in the process of the entire op-ed. I didn't read it, we didn't read it, and there were mistakes in the op-ed. That there was pressure, and then he resigned. And for many, they said, this is an example of the chilling of speech. We're coddling, we're bowing down to the masses. You should allow unpopular opinions, and the New York Times should allow unpopular opinions. And this is an example of political correctness and cancel culture run amok. Suzanne, your take.
Look, I think it's important that an outlet like the New York Times publish a diversity of opinions. And I think there could well have been a piece talking about the need for a national law enforcement to intervene in the protests. Obviously, we were at sort of a knife's edge moment when that piece came out. Most of the protests were peaceful, but there were some that were veering across into looting and violence. There are historical examples where in certain instances in particular cities, it was a positive thing to call in, the National Guard or the Federal Reserve, that things quieted down. And so it's not necessarily an argument that I think should be out of bounds. How the argument was made and the factual inaccuracies, I can't really parse. I don't know the details of that. I think, to me, what was worrisome about it was this idea of an editor being summarily forced out kind of on the heels of, what seemed like maybe a major misjudgment, but sort of a single misjudgment. I think where perhaps it was justifiable was something that really stuck with me as someone who runs an organization, which is that he hadn't read the op-ed. James Bennett hadn't actually personally looked it over. And to me, at a moment like that, where it really felt as if we were potentially teetering on the brink of, civil unrest and widespread violence in American streets, to publish something like that, offhandedly through the normal process and not even escalating it to senior people to have a careful read and really think out whether this is the right thing to be putting into the paper, to me seemed like an egregious lapse. And, I do worry, though, about protests by employees, particularly in that instance, the argument that this op-ed made time staff feel unsafe. And I understand where that comes from. And the idea that by egging on a harsh response at a moment where the press was being cracked on as well, and there've been more than 500 incidences of infringements on press freedom documented in the course of the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. So there's some validity to it, but it has a really powerful kind of Trump effect when you make that argument. And so I worry somewhat, people use the concept of safety a lot in relation to speech, and speech can make people feel unsafe in many different ways. So I think we need to just avoid that necessarily being the final answer. We need to kind of interrogate those claims of the impact of speech on safety and see how they are grounded, and also the impact on free speech if speech is silenced in the name of safety.
So there was a response to that, and there was an infamous Harper's letter, for those of you who don't know, that was signed by many writers and journalists, basically inspired by the resignation of James Bennett and this New York Times op-ed piece that in principle said, there's a chilling effect and we should, persuade, and we should have more First Amendment right, free speech. But there was also pushback to that, and the pushback to the whole concept of cancel culture. So in your opinion, is there a cancel culture, number one? And number two, what is your response to that Harper's letter that was done in response to this and basically debating free speech in this climate of the Trump administration?
Look, the term cancel culture is used very loosely. It's used for everything from someone saying something overtly racist in an academic setting and then being disciplined for it, to someone who makes a remark that really doesn't seem to evince bigoted intent, but nonetheless faces harsh reprisals. So I think you have to, one of the chapters in the book is devoted to an argument that you need to look at intent and context when you're evaluating the impact of speech. And I think that often gets lost when we lump things together under the umbrella category of cancel culture and try to judge whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think in some instances, and I talk about this in the book, I have a whole chapter on call outs and when they're justified and when they're not. I really think it's circumstance specific. Some people deserve to be canceled. There's some people, there's just this incident.
Example, Suzanne, who would you cancel?
There are a couple incidences where there's a documented track record. The senior editor at Hearst, where it's kind of a long-term track record documented meticulously over time, many complaints. I think that could be a justifiable case that he loses his job. There's another case at ABC. I don't know all the facts. And sometimes, you read more and you find, well, these things were portrayed differently than the reality. But, I'd say those are two very recent cases where it seems as though this was a real pattern of conduct over time. And, on the flip side are much more isolated incidences. I talk about one in the book where it was an administrator, Claremont McKenna, who was, much liked and appreciated on campus, and said one wrong thing to a student, talking about a student from a different background who would fit like a square peg in a round hole on campus, and she lost her job because of that one remark. And I think that's unfortunate. I talk about in the book about the need to make space for apologies, contrition, forgiveness. And so I think we've got to think hard about where we are kind of on that spectrum. When it comes to the Harper's letter, I mean, one of the things I sort of thought about in response to that is it kind of explains why I needed 20 different chapters in my book, because I feel like when you're talking about this stuff, there's sort of all these things you need to mention.
There's nuances.
Right. You need to acknowledge the harms of speech. You need to talk about how you reject hateful speech and hate crimes. You need to talk about how important it is to elevate lesser heard voices. On the flip side, you need to talk about how to protest without silencing, how to take intent and context into account. But if you sort of talk about some of those things and not the other things, I think there's a great potential to be misunderstood and for people to think you're dismissive of those aspects that you're not emphasizing. So I think points of emphasis are really important here. And what I'm trying to offer is sort of, a whole kind of philosophy toward this, where you embrace values that I think are ultimately compatible, but that are, have different dimensions and points of emphasis, each of which needs to be taken into account if we're going to defend free speech effectively while driving forward toward a more equal and inclusive society.
Hopefully, that's the hope as we get there. And you mentioned cancel culture, and we're talking about it, and often, not always, but a lot of the people who are really railing against it would describe themselves as centrist, conservative, or Republican. Not all, but many. And yet we look at the Twitter feed of Donald Trump, and we look at the 4 years of his presidency, and I look at him, I say, isn't he the king of cancel culture? And I'll give you one example, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. I'll give you another example, Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick, who exercised his First Amendment right to peacefully kneel during the national anthem in NFL games to call out police brutality against Black bodies. He was seen as crazy 2-3 years ago, but now you see the MLB season kicked off, and right before the national anthem, everyone took a knee. And oftentimes, call out culture or Twitter or these, what are seen as aggressive or disruptive methods are the tools of oftentimes people of color in marginalized communities who don't have access to the New York Times or to the Oval Office or to the pulpit. And so are we not seeing, and you could disagree with me, that the people who are advocating for cancel culture or against cancel culture are actually the ones using their power to cancel people or speech they don't like? And I will start with Donald Trump.
I think it happens on both sides, and there are instances of speech on the right and the left that lead to people being canceled. And so, that's one of the arguments I try to really skewer in the book. I have a whole chapter on the politicization of free speech and the trend toward it being seen as a right-leaning cause and right-wing activists wrapping themselves in the mantle of free speech as a smokescreen to cover up what is really kind of rank hatred and bigotry in some instances. So, what I would say is I think it can be perfectly legitimate to demand that somebody lose a position on the basis of something that they've said, but it also creates a precedent. I mean, one example that I think of is this police detective in Springfield, Massachusetts, and she was fired from the force for posting on Instagram a picture of her niece at a Black Lives Matter protest depicting some signs that were hostile toward police. I think, maybe even encouraged violence toward police. And so she was fired for this Instagram post, and a lot of people were up in arms. This is sort of a family picture. She wasn't necessarily endorsing the content of the signs. But it turned out that several years earlier, there'd been another instance in the same police department of an officer who tweeted a message in relation to the Charlottesville protests saying that those protesters in essence sort of had it coming, the way they were out in the streets, and they subjected themselves to violence through their own actions, and he was fired. And so I'm sure, I can imagine we all would have cheered his being fired and thought, this is a great thing. He's being held accountable. What he said was horrific and evinced racism. But once you accept the idea that someone can be fired on the basis of a single tweet, then it can happen again. And the next time it might be speech you agree with. And so what I argue in the book is that we need to be cautious about asking authorities to come in and clamp down on speech, whether it's the government or it's the administration of a university or corporate leaders, because we see, in the moment, you may think it's an absolutely righteous cause and the person is getting their just desserts. But once you give them that power, over time, they're likely to use it in self-serving ways that preserve their own position, that suppress dissent, that muzzle criticism. So we need to be leery of affording authorities the power to clamp down on speech.
In theory and principle, exactly, I agree with you. And my only pushback to this would be, I was approached to sign that Harper's letter. And I told the person who approached me in a very civil way that although I agree in principle with what you're saying, the effect and consequence of this at this moment in history with what's happening is not only tone deaf, but due to power and the inequities of power that exist, it is lopsided. My pushback is, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think it's both sides, because in the sense, both sides equates everything together, right? And we'll talk about this. We're seeing the police out right now against cracking down in Portland. And you hear Trump and says, look at both sides, look at their, look at, they deserve it because they're cracking down against public property and they're hooligans. And you look back and you go, wait a second, does that merit this type of crackdown? Or even when it comes to college campuses, since 1990, as you know, it first used to be I think the original cancel culture was political correctness. So if you read some literature for the past 30 years, you would think these college kids are like the most radical members of society. Like, we have to just, God forbid these college kids, what they're going to do in America. And, that's my take. You could disagree with it, where I think the power differential has to take into account with what you are saying in principle, with which I think we all agree with, that if you unleash this as the norm, it can and might be used as a precedent to beat down on whoever is marginalized in this moment or future moment in history, right? And I want to take it to colleges for a second, because like I said, your book also offers advice. So we have these contentious moments in college where, say, a Richard Spencer, who is the member of the alt-right, a Nazi group, a white supremacist group, or you have Milo Yiannopoulos, who used to be the big thing a couple of years ago. And they're outrage kings and queens. They want the protests, they want to get shut down. And you said that there is a way for college campuses to kind of balance this in a way which actually will help them, much like you helped Pakistan in the OIC get their message across, but not shutting down the speaker. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would not equate them with the position of Pakistan, the defamation of religion issue. I think Pakistan had a, kind of a valid agenda in that instance, which was to address rising religious intolerance toward Muslims. I think Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos are self-serving provocateurs, right, who really fed off sort of needling people and denigrating people and ridiculing whether it was women or immigrants or people from who are transgender or LGBT. And so I don't think there's anything good or valuable about what those two had to say. There are other very provocative right-leaning speakers who I put into a different category that, and I've actually sat and listened to some of them just because I felt like I've got to hear what this is about. And I think some of them, have more of a political argument that I think really does deserve a hearing. But when it comes to the question of what a campus should do when faced with plans by a Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos to come to campus, what they actually want the university to do, particularly go to public universities, is to try to shut them down, to deny them the opportunity to book the hall, to advertise their speech, and to
they want that, right? So
that's what they want, because then they can grandstand, they can file a lawsuit. They're a great champion of free speech. It's Milo Yiannopoulos versus the University of California. They can rile up their supporters, they can generate donations, and that's the game they were playing quite successfully for a time. And so in our work at Penn America, we do a lot of work on campus speech, and we urged university authorities not to fall into that trap and to instead say, all right, if you insist on coming to campus, we're going to subject you to the same rules as anybody else, but we're not going to silence you, even though your message is noxious. We're going to say we reject it. We're going to make sure nobody mistakes your opportunity to come to campus for an endorsement on our part. But if they have a neutral rule where more or less anybody can rent the auditorium at, for example, the University of Florida, I think it's a mistake to try to deprive it to Richard Spencer on the basis of his viewpoint. Under the First Amendment, That's unconstitutional. He's going to sue. He's probably going to prevail. What the University of Florida ultimately did was they gave him an auditorium. It was sort of not the most convenient spot on campus. They told him what kind of a day he could speak. You can't restrict that too much, but you could put some parameters on it. And it ended up fizzling out. And the same thing happened with Milo Yiannopoulos when he was coming, trying to come back to Berkeley. They let him speak and he had a small audience and it was a non-event. And so actually, that approach has completely de-escalated this. I don't think either of us has probably heard much about Milo or Spencer in the last couple of years. And I think it's because, they began to lose at this game, and the opportunity to back the university into a corner and get them to lash out and try to silence these provocateurs, started to fail. And then they didn't have much more to add to the discourse.
And it's interesting that ignoring was a response, right? You use your First Amendment's right and speech to basically ignore what they're saying, let them do what they want to do, which denies them the oxygen which they crave, which is the headlines.
Precisely.
And it works. And I want to talk about a kind of a pivot here to what has been, some would say, a provocative advancement, which is gaining some traction. And there was a book by Andrew Marantz, who's a New Yorker writer. He wrote this book called The Anti-Social, where he actually spends time with all these folks, right? All the people on the fringe, the far right, the people who are pumping out disinformation. And he seems to argue, and I was on a panel with him, that maybe we should be having less free speech right now, because First Amendment, or the free speech as it is right now in the United States, is being used as a weapon, not only against marginalized communities, but as a weapon against democracy, as a weapon against privacy, as a weapon to promote disinformation. With a 2020 election coming up, where the President of the United States of America, in his interview with Chris Wallace, said he would not commit to accepting the election results. So for people who are pro-democracy and pro-Constitution, Bill of Rights, but are saying that the First Amendment is being used by these hostile actors as a weapon, as a cudgel, not just against minorities and women, but also against democracy, and maybe we should have, quote unquote, less, not more, your response?
Here's the thing. What are you really arguing for when you argue for less free speech, not more? Are you arguing that you want the Trump administration to have more power and discretion to punish speech, to pare back the First Amendment and allow them to intervene in response to what they deem disinformation or fake news, or what they deem hateful speech? I think that very powerfully illustrates the danger. It's who's making the judgment and what kind of leeway do they have. Fortunately, in this country, we still have courts, we still have co-equal branches of government. So when Trump tried to clamp down on protesters in Lafayette Square, and I think would have gone much further and may still go much further, and is now deploying unmarked federal troops to American cities, we have courts that will step in and stop him from doing that. And part of what they rely on is the First Amendment and the limitations on government's ability to suppress speech based on viewpoint. And I think getting rid of that is, you like, if you have your fantasy of Barack Obama and maybe it's Michelle and Elizabeth Warren all rolled up into one, with Thurgood Marshall, so they'd make perfect decisions in every case and always protect all the speech you wanted to be protected and outlaw all the speech that we can all agree is worthless. That would be great. That would be, that's a wonderful fantasy, but it's not the world we live in. And I think we're much better off putting constraints on government's ability to suppress speech, that on balance, they're going to use those powers in ways that we don't like. Maybe at times there'll be, moments we can celebrate it. We're right behind them, but, wait for the next election and it being turned against us.
Our participants are in sync with me and my questions, because they just asked a question I was going to ask as a follow-up. You mentioned Portland, and I'm glad you did. For people who are not paying attention, they should, with what's happening in Portland right now, the crackdown. You have masked law enforcement, God knows what agency they're from, unidentified, who are using tear gas, I would say violence against men and women, who for the most part, as we've seen, are peaceably demonstrating, a peaceable assembly, which is actually an exercise of their First Amendment freedoms and rights. And you have a chapter in the book, Beware Expanded Government Controls on Speech. So with what's happening in Portland right now, with what's happening in the Trump administration, what can people do when the government seems to be overstepping its bound and trampling down not just on the First Amendment right to speak, but the First Amendment right to assembly in Portland?
You know, we've got to vote. You know, we have a government that has shown persistent disrespect for First Amendment rights. At PEN America, as you know, we filed suit against the president for his threats and acts of retaliation against journalists and the media. You know, over the last few months, we've seen repeated attempts by the White House to prevent books from being published. You know, this is an administration of Colin Kaepernick, you mentioned a minute ago. You know, President Trump was egging on the NFL to punish Kaepernick for his speech, you know, to which he was sort of an indirect violation of the First Amendment. The lawyers told me a court might not recognize that, but it seems to me that for a president to use his power in that way as a kind of bank shot, trying to get a private actor to punish speech, is also an abuse of the First Amendment and of his authority. So I think we're in a precarious situation, and that these violations on the streets of Portland bring it to a new level. I mean, as someone who's done work all over the world on free speech issues, when I watch a video of an American taken off the streets of a sidewalk and shoved into an unmarked car while bystanders look on and shout in alarm, you know, I think of China, I think of Hong Kong, I think of Iran and Russia and Turkey and parts of the world, you know, that where we at PEN America with our colleagues and other PEN organizations around the world are advocating day in and day out for the rights of jailed writers who face the steepest price for the exercise of their expressive rights. So I think it's profoundly alarming. You know, a lot of these mayors and cities are going to court trying to block these federal officials from coming in. And I think that's very important. I think we have to raise our voices in protest. I think a lot of Americans, a lot of former officials, both Republican and Democrat, have strenuously objected to this. I don't know if it's going to be enough to get this administration to stop.
Yeah, real quick, do you think it's going to get worse leading up to the election?
You know, I worry that it will. I think we're in a precarious situation in this country, and we have a power-hungry president who's in big trouble. And I do worry about what he may do in order to try to hold on to office.
You know, and as he tries to hold on to office, as we have the, it looks like the military out in the U.S. streets, right? The war on terror has come home, and the battleground are the suburban streets, and our law enforcement looks like the military in Fallujah. Another major concern for Americans and for democracy is the role of disinformation on Facebook and Twitter. And a lot of our participants have this fear and this concern about Facebook and Twitter specifically and their role in disinformation. And I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, one of the highest performing posts the highest performing post on Facebook was a Breitbart disinformation piece that praised hydrochloroquine, right? And talked about, not wearing a mask during a deadly pandemic that has killed 150,000 people with over 4 million infected individuals. What should be the role of Facebook and Twitter and social media companies, private companies, in this day and age to squash disinformation as it relates to the First Amendment and freedom of speech?
Look, I have 2 chapters in the book where I focus on this issue of online content, and they kind of cut in both directions. The first is why we need to be leery of giving companies unfettered discretion to police speech at will. And I go through a whole kind of series of reasons. They're self-serving, they have their own profit motives, they tend to do a poor job. There are disempowered groups that seem to be disproportionately suppressed when the companies are aggressive in policing speech. On the flip side, I absolutely agree that we have to hold these companies accountable for the harms that the platforms are causing. And so the question becomes, we're going to have to far more aggressively superintend speech online. I don't think there's any question about it. You now have the companies scrambling to do it. Today, Twitter disabled the account of Donald Trump Jr. because he was tweeting about hydrochloroquine. You have several proposals in the US Congress to pare back Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the grant of blanket immunity to the platforms for liability for content posted by users on those services. And so things are changing. The companies will become much more aggressive in policing and removing content. COVID has been sort of a test case, and they've actually done a pretty good job scouring the platforms for conspiracy theories, quackery, false information, and also elevating the CDC, the WHO, state health departments, and other credible sources. So they're sort of demonstrating that it can be done in a responsible way. I think one important element is as we get more aggressive in removing content, we need better mechanisms for as a fail-safe for legitimate content that gets improperly taken down. So the inevitable false positives that are going to happen when companies are deleting much more. And today, if that happens to you and you've got a perfectly bona fide post that somehow disappears for no reason, you're kind of out of luck. You can access these online appeal processes, but they very often yield no result.
Especially if your business is involved, right?
Right, you can have financial implications. You often don't even understand. A lot of people don't know why their post was removed in the first place. So that needs to be significantly augmented. And I have a proposal I talk about in the book about creating a whole service that would be, almost like a public defender, but for content removal. So if people really feel like they have a legitimate case that, hey, this post was satirical or there was nothing wrong with it, that they have somebody they can get on the phone quickly in real time to advocate for them and get the content restored. And I think that's sort of the way to keep free speech intact while equipping the platforms and enabling the platforms to be much more aggressive in removing misinformation, hateful speech, and other categories where there's pretty broad societal agreement that we don't want these things in our feeds.
Ulrich, you just touched upon a question I was going to ask. That look, Twitter is a private company, Facebook's a private company, and in your book, you mention what they should do. And you also mentioned the responsibilities of individuals, and we'll get to that towards the end. We all have a right and responsibility, and we can be proactive actors, right? But in the absence of Facebook and Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg doing the right thing, as we can clearly see, and I think I can make the case that Mark Zuckerberg has lagged. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, I just interviewed her last week. She personally blames Mark Zuckerberg as the leader of Facebook for allowing this type of disinformation, hate, and conspiracy theories that she says directly attacks her and her family. The stuff that people are attacking her about are from these Facebook posts, which are completely debunked conspiracy theories, attributing violence to her like before she was even born, right? So in the absence of these private actors doing the good work of self-auditing, right? What should the role of the government be in regulating these companies? Because Elizabeth Warren, who you mentioned in your Avengers lineup with Obama and Clinton, and I think who else, Thurgood Marshall, is all about breaking these companies up. She says it's just too harmful to democracy, to privacy, to marginalized communities. What should be the government's role, if any, in regulating or cracking down on Facebook and Twitter and their proliferation of disinformation and hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to somewhat separate the First Amendment arguments from the antitrust arguments. I'm not an antitrust expert, and I think there's some interesting theories being advanced on economic grounds about why the companies should be broken up. But it's hard for me to evaluate those. When it comes to free speech, you're right. They have been extremely reluctant to take this on, and Mark Zuckerberg probably above all. And I think a big part of the reason for that is that they do best with often the most incendiary, provocative, outlandish posts that go viral and trend and are so compelling and riveting to particular subgroups, and the level of engagement in those subgroups goes up and up, and they're able to sell endless ads to their customers. And it's a very powerful business model that I think they believe will be undercut if they become more attentive and careful in terms of moderating content. I think they are coming to realize, I think this advertiser boycott, which was stimulated by a bunch of civil rights groups, has been important in terms of driving forward the argument and raising the cost to Facebook of operating this way. And I think more in terms of what the role of government should be, I think we need to be careful about government stepping into ideological or viewpoint-based policing. I think where government can make a difference is to force greater transparency. I mean, one of the biggest problems is we have very little visibility into how this moderating unfolds, how much content is disappearing, what kinds of content are disappearing. Researchers who've tried to probe into this have a terrible time getting usable data out of the companies. When they do, it's sort of all pockmarked, supposedly in response to privacy concerns. But there's not a real partnership to allow them to get behind this and understand it and unpack it and figure out whether there are regulatory regimes that would work. So I think number one is transparency, so that we have more of an opportunity as a society to decide how we want these issues adjudicated.
We have about 3 months until the election. So good luck to America, because if you were paying attention, the top posts on Facebook, unfortunately, belong to some suspect sites, which are promoting some disinformation right now during, again, a deadly pandemic that has killed 150,000 Americans. There's a lot more to talk to you about, but we have about 5 minutes. And there is something I want to touch upon that you mentioned in the book. Twitter is oftentimes a toxic place, understatement of the year. Facebook is as well. You said there is a space, or should be a space, for forgiveness for people who do the errant tweet, people who accidentally call out someone, for people who make a mistake. What does forgiveness look like to you when it comes to us, the community that wants to cancel someone who, let's just say, deserved it, but then has contrition?
I think, again, it comes to intent and context. There's some acts that, even if the person is contrite, it's had an impact that, and I talk in the book about Larry Summers and his comments about women made when he was the president of Harvard, that women were inferior when it came to math and science. And I believe he was contrite, but for a president of the university to say that in a professional and academic setting, and the comments were widely quoted, and you can imagine for every woman on the Harvard faculty or student body, that was undercutting and
Right.
gave them a sense that they, at the highest levels of the university, weren't regarded as equals. And he ultimately paid the price of his job for that. And I think it was just a comment at that level that was impossible to walk back. I talk also in the book about the idea of a duty of care that goes up depending on how big your platform is. So if you've got your own television show, or you're in front of a lecture hall of 1,000 people, you bear a different level of responsibility than you would around the dinner table or in a conversation with a single friend. So I think the opportunity and the space for forgiveness varies, but that all of us should keep in mind and keep an open mind to that possibility, and whether it's warranted. And maybe it's not immediate forgiveness, but it's somebody who steps back from things, but then ultimately comes back in because they didn't commit an offense that warrants 30 years of exile or an end to a career. And these consequences can be very draconian. Just to come back to something we spoke about earlier, I think there are a lot of people at more junior levels who kind of quietly have either been punished for speech or gone silent. I've heard from a lot of people just over the last couple of days as the book is coming out about experiences that they've had on campuses or in corporations where they feel very inhibited to speak up about even topics that, I believe we should be able to talk about as a society. And there are ways of talking about respectfully, and there are productive results that might arise from those conversations. And yet they're holding back because of this fear that anything they say may be misinterpreted, and that the consequences of that misinterpretation can very quickly spiral out of control. And I think about that myself. If I say any wrong thing, it can come back to bite. And part of that's good because you're more conscientious and more careful, and that's a positive thing. But I also worry that it can go too far and take whole subjects off the table.
And John Ronson had a book called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" that came out a few years ago that talks about some of these people who made a mistake, and he follows them and sees where they are in their lives right now, which I thought was very illuminating. But he did say something that, there used to be a concept of throwing in the towel. And in the 19th century, when it came to public flogging or public humiliation, after a while, America stopped it because it was seen as torture. But with the internet and the 24/7 aspect of the internet, you're assaulted at all times. I, for one, have been assaulted by the right and also by the left. And it can see, if you're not used to it, if you've never been attacked by the online mob, it could be overwhelming. And if you don't know how to pivot and respond to it, it can destroy not only your emotional well-being, but also your career. I have time, probably 3 more minutes, 4 minutes. I want to get 2 more questions in if possible. It's a good question from one of our listeners. Thank you, participants, for your great questions. Some on the left see the First Amendment as the work of a founding leadership that was white and oppressive towards the Black population of the time. So this line of thought goes, the First Amendment is suspect. How do you respond to that kind of argument?
I think it's true. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is this revelatory moment of talking to a young Black student activist and asking her a question about the First Amendment. She said, the First Amendment wasn't written for me. And I was sort of taken aback because I thought, gosh, how can someone, like really smart woman, be so alienated from this core precept? But she was talking about, exactly what you were saying. When those rights were guaranteed, her forebears would not have been around the table and protected by them. And so I think that's a fair criticism, but it doesn't mean that the First Amendment isn't useful to Black people and to the cause of fighting against anti-Black racism. And I believe it really is. I mean, over time and historically, whether you look at the cases in the United States or whose rights are at stake around the world, it's the dissidents, the social justice advocates, those who are driving toward a different society, taking on the power structures, defying the governments. Those are the people who need the protection the most. It's not those who are sort of sitting pretty because they hold all the power and the resources in the society. They're in much less danger of having their expressive rights infringed. They're not saying edgy things. They're not challenging, whether it's the police or the government. So I think it's a fair point that system was very skewed. There were also no women at the table, but I still believe women have everything to gain from free speech protections.
Yeah, some are just saying Black Lives Matter and are kneeling peacefully during the anthem to protest police brutality. Final question before I give it up to Beth, and thank you again for all the wonderful questions and the back and forth and the Q&A. I tried to get to as many of them as I could. I know I couldn't get to all of them. Thank you to the 70 or so folks who were on. Really appreciate it. I hope you found this to be helpful. And most importantly, buy this book. Buy it from Politics and Prose. Support your independent bookstores during this recession. Buy it right now. It's a great book. I actually did read it. And in addition to talking about all these issues that you guys actually mentioned in the Q&A, Suzanne also gives advice. In the final 2 minutes that I have, there are people obviously who care deeply about this country. They care deeply about the Constitution. They care deeply about our rights. They care deeply about our democracy, and they want to fight for it. They're in the streets right now. Some are getting tear gassed. We have an election coming up, 2020 election, which I know this is hyperbole, but many say might be the most important election of our lifetimes because the rule of law, accountability, ethics, the First Amendment, everything that people have fought for might be on the line due to this Trump presidency. We are all average Americans in some respect. We all have limited superpowers. For the people who are listening right now or the people who will listen, what is the role of Americans at this moment? What can they do to defend the First Amendment and free speech?
Look, I agree. I think this is the most important election, certainly of my lifetime. And it's hard to imagine the stakes being any higher. I think we all bear an obligation to do as much as we can as citizens to help shape the future that we want to see. And that happens at the ballot box, that happens in the run up to it, that happens in terms of fighting against disinformation and efforts to discredit the election and challenge the outcome. When it comes to free speech and the drive for a more equitable and inclusive society, which to me is, I hope, a long-term quest that, I hope I know we'll outlive this administration. I think we have an obligation to take it upon ourselves to defend free speech and also to be standard bearers for a more inclusive, equal, and just society, and that you can do both of those things. And that's really what I try to explain in the book, is that these sets of principles, which are both, to me, wrapped into the DNA of the United States of America, never realized perfectly, always flawed, with huge, glaring, and inexcusable lapses, but values that we profess, values that a lot of us as citizens believe in deeply. And I believe we need to behave in ways that uphold both of those sets of values and demonstrate in practice how they can cohabit and fit together and bring about a society that is both equal and free.
Right on time. You finished 30 seconds before. Perfect, like a pro. Happy Publication Day to Suzanne. Buy the book, Dare to Speak, buy from Politics and Prose. Bradley, will take us home. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Waj.
Well, thank you both really for a very thoughtful and illuminating discussion. As you both said, this whole issue of the tensions between free speech on the one hand and bigotry, harmful speech, disinformation on the other is so complicated and nuanced. But that's why Suzanne's new book is so important, all 20 chapters of it, because there's so much to it to sort through. Again, the title of the book is Dare to Speak, and you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in this evening. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
So much. Thanks so much for having me.